Hello and welcome to our second panel of the day as we celebrate the 100th birthday of Stuart High School, 1923 to 2023 today. For those of you who I haven't met before, I'm Nancy Turrell. I'm the Executive Director, CEO of MartinArts, which is the umbrella for the Arts Council and the Arts Foundation. The foundation is taking the lead on raising funds and the vision for turning this high school building into an arts and cultural center, which will be engaging and inspiring future generations in the arts in all its form, performing, visual, literary arts, as well as preserving a beautiful piece of character in our wonderful community. I know that this was, just as a little point of reference, this space that we're sitting in was historically the auditorium for the school. This is a false floor that's on top of where the seats were. If you went to school here, this is not what it looked like. These walls back behind here didn't exist. It was all the way open to the back, and the floor came down from the back, sort of flattened out down here in front of the stage, which is right behind me, and then came in and down, angled from both sides of the building as well. We've actually we've cut out a piece of the floor and looked under it to see all that original infrastructure. It's kind of interesting. And if you sign up to go on one of our tours, we'll go downstairs and you can see how the ceiling is raked, which is, the opposite of what it would be if you're not standing on this floor. So enjoy our panel. You're going to hear some great information both about the history of this building, but also the 1955 and 1956 classroom additions that are out in front. So it'll be a really great conversation led by one of our board members and very long time volunteer and advocate for the arts, Nicki von Vanno. So Nicki, take it away.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's so nice to see everybody, and I'm so happy to meet some of you that I've never met before, but I've known all of you because I'm a history nerd. So let me tell you how we're going to do this. I have 3 panelists with me: Sandy Thurlow, Don Armstrong Jr., and Alicia Weber. I'm going to let them, when we get to in a couple of minutes, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves to you. And then here's how the panel will go. I have a general question. The first question is a general question for the 3 of you. The next 3 questions are, there's a specific question for Don, one for Sandy, one for Alicia, and then at the very end, we'll have what they see as the future of this building. And so they'll each answer that question for you, and hopefully it'll bolster Nancy's dreams. So without further ado, Don, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'd be glad to. I'm so pleased to be here today, and I've seen some familiar faces. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. In 1932, my dad was on this stage graduating from Stuart High School.
Wow.
And the original auditorium is where I have many of my most vivid memories of going to school here myself. I went to school starting in 1956 when it was grades 1 through 12, and continued to go through most of elementary school, and then came back for junior high. So I spent a lot of time in this building and the other old buildings on campus. My dad was the primary designer for not this building, but the 2 modern buildings in front that flank this building and are going to be restored as part of this project. So I remember when he was working on these projects for the Martin County School Board, which began in the mid-1950s and continued into the 70s. And so I'm just so pleased to be here today to be able to talk about that. Sandy, you want the mic?
Sandy is a well-known local historian. and she was the devoted partner of a very prominent local attorney who's left us. But she is a wonderful historian, a wonderful person, a great mother, a great grandmother, a great aunt. I mean, she's an amazing woman. So what's left? Please tell us about your connection to the Stuart High School.
Well, my connection is through my husband. And since I appointed myself local historian in addition to our, institutions, the Historical Society and Historic Heritage, I felt like his reunions were just like my material for research. And so this morning I just looked at, I have kept every class reunion. They would have all class reunions. So I have that. That's my connection. I won't talk that much right now, later. Alicia?
My name is Alicia Weber, and I am very nervous to be on this panel because I'm very new to Stuart. I am a retired art historian from Washington, D.C. My career began at the Archives of American Art. I then worked for the chief architect of the National Park Service and finished my career managing the Fine Arts program of the U.S. General Services under the Office of the Architect. So I have a passion for history, art history, architecture, and historic preservation. And I think it's so important to any communion. Although I'm very nervous, you all are so welcoming. I see people greeting each other. I see people talking to each other, sharing memories. And that is one reason I want to support this and be here. But I'm here really for 3 reasons. Sandy Thurlow, Don Armstrong Jr., and Gloria Fike. Because without them, my connection with Stuart High School would be, I think it's on Kenner Highway somewhere.
Thank you all. Sandy, as Stuart's historian, how does this high school, this building, contribute to local history?
Well, you see. It's not exactly answering your question, but the fact that it is on the main track, that we pass it all the time, whenever we go anywhere. And it's just like a gift from Providence that it's here to restore. And so it's connected in every way. Think of all the people that went through these rooms and the stories and the memories, and it's perfect to restore.
I just had one observation from our earlier panel when Karen asked if there was any arts. And the football players said, "Oh no, we all play football." But then we heard about the guy that played when they raised the flag, and we heard about the marching bands and the flute players. So clearly there was music being done in this building and in this campus.
And they had class plays, very much. And
Yes.
I so wanted, when Dale was speaking last, one of his buddies, Ronnie Nelson, married the art teacher for this school, Lucille Greco. And she's still alive, and we've just got to bring her back in. She would have some stories about the art.
Wow. Great, thank you for that too. For Don, could you explain your father's role as the architect for the Martin County School Board during the 50s and the 60s? And I think you did that a little bit in your opening, but if you could elaborate a little.
Sure, yeah, I'd be glad to. And I know my father would be thrilled that there's a new interest now in the buildings that he did here in Martin County. Dad grew up here, and then went to University of Florida where he got his degree in architecture. And he and a classmate, Kendall Sterrett, who lived in Fort Pierce, planned to open up an architecture firm together. And so they both graduated at the same time. My dad went to work for a construction company while I worked on his licensing exams and all that. Ken received his license and opened up a architectural practice in Fort Pierce. So when after Dad got his registration, he came back to Stuart, and he and Ken opened up a practice in the Arthur DeHone building. I know many of you know where that is on the Confusion Corner. They're up on the second floor there. And almost immediately they began doing, really it was implementing a plan by the Martin County School Board at that time. So now we're talking about the early 1950s to accommodate the baby boom. So kids like me, this whole wave of kids now are in Martin County, and all they had were these old school buildings that were aging and they didn't have nearly enough classrooms. So something tells me, knowing the two of them, they probably saw this coming, and they kind of figured into, let's set up a little branch office in Stuart and make some contacts with the Martin County School Board to see what happens. And it really worked to everybody's advantage, because they, beginning with a classroom for the Stuart Elementary School, and for those of you all who don't know, this whole block was really two campuses. The elementary school campus, it was down on, what would that be, the west end of the block, and then down on this end, that was the Stuart High School. So it was grades 1 through 12 were all going here on this block in two different campuses. So their first building, which is very similar to the two in front of this building, which they designed, the first building was for Stuart Elementary. And it was the first of several buildings they did for Stuart Elementary. And they apparently, the school board liked what they did, and so from that point on, beginning with the two buildings in front of this building, they were designing buildings for the school board for the next 6 or 7 years. And then when my dad, Ken, kind of established his own practice in Fort Pierce by then, so he left the firm, and Dad brought in Richard Pryor from Ohio, and they became Armstrong and Pryor. They then proceeded to design practically every school building in Martin County that was built in the 1950s and early 1960s. The most prominent was Julian D. Parker, which won a national design award, and Dad went to a conference and presented the project at that conference, and wrote a piece on the architecture of, sort of the modern architecture of school design, which goes to the point that he and Ken and Richard, the other two partners, came out of architecture school at my dad's case, University of Florida, during a time when there was this new, really pervasive movement in architecture, that's broadly referred to as the modern movement. The particular style they used here on this campus was the international style, which was an approach to architecture that was entirely different than, say, the approach that Mr. Trimble took in the 1920s on this building. And you can see those. That's the beautiful thing about this little ensemble that includes this old building and the two modern buildings in front. Was I can't think of a better sort of outdoor classroom if someone wanted to understand what happened between 1920 and 1950. in architecture broadly, you know, in school architecture specifically. But the approach to architecture they took was based on an idea that architecture should be an honest expression of things like its structural loads, so the structural systems of the buildings were exposed and were part of the outer image of the building. You can see that on the two buildings my dad did. It has a reinforced concrete structural system, which was relatively new at that time. So they were experimenting with new technologies, and they not only just use that in a functional way, but when you walk in front of those buildings where the doors are, there's an overhang that has these really dramatically cantilevered, that's a term for a beam that projects out from its support, these really dramatically cantilevered beams that form the walkway in front of the building. The fact that the blocks that the building was made out of were exposed. That was another trait of the modern architecture, the international style. A building like this, not sure what, is this clay tile? Do you know what was the structure of this building? It would get an inch of stucco over the surface of it, so and you would have really no sense of what the structure of the building was. So the modern style was an entirely different philosophy of architecture based on what they saw as moral principles of honesty and authenticity, and you would experience the building as a whole. You're not creating sort of a symbolic box, with ornamentation, which is equally valid and produce, God knows, wonderful architecture. But the modern style is just entirely different ethos, and that's where these modern buildings that my dad did, was part of. And so I think I'll just leave it at that point. But Dad continued to practice architecture until he passed away in 1994. We were partners for several years after I graduated from the University of Florida, and I had my career here for about 10 years. And so he really just lived and breathed architecture, building construction, until he took his last breath. So it's a really exciting story, and I'm glad that the story of these modern buildings in Martin County is really now being told, because it really speaks to this county and its sort of openness to new modern ideas and how that affected the society here, the children, as well as just having practical buildings in the environment.
Alicia, I just want to say that I'm very envious of your career. And I so wish that I could be you. My daughter told me on the phone last night, Mom, you should have been an archivist locked away in some library somewhere, and then you never talk to anybody.
Much more comfortable with a computer.
It wasn't like that. She traveled all over the place, went to the courthouses, did art on the courthouses, did a barcode sidewalk in Seattle or someplace. She was out there.
That's wonderful.
Well, as a retired historian and curator on the federal level, what interested you specifically in the preservation of this building?
Well, first of all, I love Stuart. You are a community that gives back. Marty knows I love to volunteer, and when Nancy got in touch with me, I was so excited. To me, looking at this as a historian, I have to pick up on a lot of what Don said. You have a 1920s Art Deco building. Then, from the federal presence again, you had a log cabin built by the Civilian Conservation Corps, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal programs to employ people. Then in the 40s, you had a wooden gymnasium. And then in the 50s, here comes modernism. And I have to give, history connects us on so many levels. I'm a military brat. What influenced me growing up? I pulled the lucky straw in the family and got to go to high school in Paris. What influences Don's father? He was serving overseas in Europe in World War II. And you can't help to be influenced by the architecture of Europe. There's such a great breadth there. And also having an interest in Bauhaus and modernism. I thought this was fascinating. But see, so I see the connection from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. And I also see the connection, something Don's father did and something Trimble did. Why was Spanish colonial revival so popular? You could acclimate it to Florida's climate. You had open courtyards. You had covered arcades, and I love the cantilever modernistic arcade. You know, you can see arches, but it's the same thing. You had clear story windows, and I hope in the exhibit, if you stand back and look up, you can see the clear story windows. Unfortunately, the clear story windows on this side of the Armstrong buildings is plywood or I don't know, something. But all of this was the hot air would rise, you had airflow. There you had clear story windows and then jalousie windows on the other side that would allow that flow. And then back to what Sandy said, you're on Ocean Boulevard. How important was education that you were in the heart of downtown Stuart? And so I'm just learning. I mean, I told Nancy, and where's Gloria? There is such a story to be told here. I was doing research, I have to share this story, on Don's father down at Stuart Heritage, and I just wanted a good photo of him, and we're looking everywhere, and you know, Gloria's like, I'll go upstairs and I'll look, and I turn around and, oh, there he is in the 1929 football team. And then I turn around again, and Nancy had put up something, I think it was Keck, not Nancy, I'm sorry, Gloria, what was it? Stuart's first architect, was it Keck or something? And so that drew me. Here's another story, the development of the architectural community in Stuart. And I must say, in closing a little bit, I see architecture as an art form. I just, it's, you know, it's wonderful. And to preserve that is so important. And I have to go back to my husband. I'm a military brat. I grew up all over the world. But the reason we came back to Stuart is for a short period of time. He was sent off to the Sisters of St. Joseph to buck him up and attended school, what's it now, Riverside Park. But it's the first thing you share. Oh, that was my science building. I think it's the Children's Museum now, right?
With the chapel.
The chapel, okay, sorry. And this all connects us. And I just have to say one other thing to Sandy. What I've loved about this day is the word she keeps using, community. That's why this building is so important. It was then and will be, I hope it has been said in the future for another 100 years, part of the community.
This is a question for all of you. How would you like MartinArts to honor the history of this space in its new presence as a community arts center?
Well, I would say first off, doing just what you're doing. So having this project to use these old buildings, to reuse them and put them back into purpose, is just fantastic. So that one's already been checked off. But I would say, I did a little bit of thinking about this. You know, I think I'd love to see the Martin County Council for the Arts, you know, bring attention, kind of keep going with bringing attention to historic buildings in Martin County, because we're really seeing them destroyed at an increasing rate. There was a beloved family doctor, Dr. Parker, who I know many of you know, had a beautiful Spanish-style house. It was just demolished a few months ago. And we have no protections here. There's nothing that's designated as protected. And old buildings are always under a market pressure to be demolished, because in many cases it's always not the most practical thing to do. Saving old buildings requires other kinds of desires other than that. And so I think anything that could be done to kind of snowball this into a broader appreciation, it has to begin with an appreciation, but just making people aware of our historic buildings and where they are, and a little bit of history about them, their connection with the community. And then hopefully that appreciation will lead to more of them being saved. It's a losing battle, but you have to at least put up the fight and try to spread the word on that. The next thing I had on my list was an exhibit, but check that one off too.
That's just the beginning.
If you haven't seen it, please look at the exhibit, which is just really remarkable. And we're so lucky to have Alicia doing the exhibits for us, as well as compiling the information that was so needed to do everything being done here. Conduct tours. Check that one off. I talked to Nancy. That one's in the works already. But my final one is a little more specific and concrete, and that's to nominate this building and the two buildings in front, because really this is an ensemble. It's a single work, design work, and should be treated as such. Nominate these buildings to have them placed on the National Register of Historic Places. Because I think many people think that we have more buildings on the National Register here in Martin County, but it's a tiny handful. There are hardly any. And yet we have many historic buildings that are worthy. I did the nomination for the Lyric Theater, so I'm very aware of the process and the criteria that you have to meet. We have many buildings in this county that meet those criteria. It doesn't have to be, where George Washington slept, to be considered eligible for the National Register. A building can derive its significance purely locally, because we recognize how important our cities and towns are, and their local histories as part of American history. So that would be I think the possible goal that could come from this, that would, I think, be maybe the most significant of all, is to get these buildings on the National Register, so that they can also begin drawing in grant monies and other sorts of benefits, that could help with this whole project. That's my bucket list.
Sandy, what's your bucket list?
Well, I think that Don explaining the architecture of the buildings out in front, I was reminded of how you can go in an art gallery and the docent will explain the painting, and it just opens up so much. And now I have a better appreciation just from your explanation of how this is a unit and how it does work to keep those more modern buildings, that it is a part of it. And so I see that is part of, the art of the building itself and the plan for using this for the arts. And I was struck by something that Nancy said about she wanted this to be like the environmental center. And that really struck a chord. We have Suzanne, who's on the board there, but anyone who's had anything to do with the environmental center knows how valuable it is. And if this can be for the arts what the environmental center is for appreciation of nature and the environment, oh boy, it's wonderful. And that's why this community is so special. And that people retire and come here of such quality, and they pitch in. So
I once joked, I hate golf, I'm really bad at it. Can't stand bridge. And I've got horrible skin cancer, so there's nothing else to do.
lucky us.
Can I jump in?
Yes, please.
when Nancy first approached me, and I love the idea that it's all the arts and culture. And I want to raise the bar a little bit. Landscape architecture, you're going to have green space back here. Make it a lab or a study center for the innovative things in some of these things. Nancy knows and Marty knows I'm very passionate about ADA and arts and accessibility. And in fact, for this, I wanted to try to have a touch model. Think how wonderful it would be for a visually impaired person that you could have a site plan with all the buildings. As you said, it was a canvas. Please look at Don's father's drawings. There are keys there. This means this material. And that was you're honoring the integrity of the materials. That someone visually impaired could touch that. If you have a painting, you can have something made out of fabric. It does not have to be expensive, but you make it very inclusive. Arts therapy. Our children are going through so many problems now with depression and so on. This is an educational institution to bring in some of that. And finally, more architectural arts. There is a story here to be told. And where is Robin? Also, the story of segregation in Martin County schools. All of these stories make us a community and reach out to everyone. So I also want to say preservation through documentation. Don's father's drawings are all we have left of the cafeteria, the elementary school. We have the CCC log cabin, luckily, but reading the historic structures report, how hard they have nothing from Trimble. You know, there are no plans there. It's kind of archival arts, which I know Sandy and Gloria are so wonderful about. If we didn't have these resources and to get the kids involved, you know, like the environment, have a landscape, have a landscape architect out there. Have an architect, I took a drafting class. I still love to draft, it's just, there's so many things that can engage.
Sandy, do you know landscape architect? Does he help us?
Can I jump in now?
Yes, now we're not shy anymore.
But I was so taken because East Stewart, the euphemism for the Black community that is just right our neighbor, so close, and it's still close. And the Boys and Girls Club is being built. And we can make up and just bring us all together and all use this facility, unlike it was in the before 1960s. So, hope that can
We're available to take questions now if we have any questions from the audience members.
So, I'm sorry. So I'm Karen Jansen. I'm curious about, as we think about reconstructing these structures and making it, so that we can use them as art studios and whatnot, I'm curious if you have an opinion about perhaps starting with your father's buildings that he designed because it's separate from this one, and that they could maybe be more accessible or used even before we start working on this structure. Also, speaking about landscape architects, we have an entire beautiful front lawn that could also be developed while we're still working on the funding for the major building, but we can have two spaces, those two front buildings, and then the landscaped area where we can continue to have programming and stuff for the community. Would that make sense in your mind?
I think that would be a wonderful thing to do. That's something the architect for this project would have better facts as to how whether that could be done or whether it be practical or not. Sometimes there's benefits to doing a cluster of buildings all at one time while you have all the subcontractors out and things like that. Or sometimes there's benefits to doing them one at a time. So that's a call the architect would make. But I would pass that suggestion on. I I think that's a terrific idea. I think the sooner, my experience with these sorts of community projects is the sooner you can show something completed, the better for the momentum of the project. If you sort of say in January we're going to do this, but it's not till February the next year before it happens, people tend to get distracted in the meantime. And I think so. Maybe having some mini sort of grand openings, and so to speak, might be a good way to kind of roll the whole thing out.
Nancy, I thought, talking about Don's dad's buildings out front, Nancy Turrell mentioned in your earlier meeting that those buildings are scheduled to be destroyed.
No.
Did I misinterpret that?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
That was Don Brady.
We wanted to tear it down, you said Nancy saved it.
Okay. Good on Nancy.
And I should mention that the one of the more prominent buildings Armstrong and Pryor did was it's the Seacoast Bank today, but the that First National Bank of Stuart that's on US 1 Colorado Avenue, and that's one of the number of buildings they did thanks to enlightened business people in the community. And again, those, and I hope it's still true today, but growing up in Stuart, these prominent buildings are sort of become part of a person's sense of place and who they are, in a community. I think that it's wonderful that East Stuart is apparently going to embark on some restoration, recognition of the older buildings. Their dad did St. Monica's Church and a number of other buildings. And that history, with all of its troubles and joys and miseries, it's important to understand that, and we can use buildings to teach people that history.
Julie Priest. Don, I knew you when we both
Julie, hi.
We used to have brown hair at one time. For those of you who aren't aware, Don actually is the founder of Stuart Heritage. And he was very active back then. This was in the 80s. And then he left town and he became a professor, if I'm correct.
That's true.
And now he's back. So he came back to his beloved Stuart. Thank you for doing that. Just want to bring to everyone's attention, there is a possibility that we could make this part of a historic district with your dad's buildings, this building, the old courthouse, the Lyric. We could make this with the contributing, they call them contributing buildings. In the future, we could look at that. We would have to do it in coordination with the City of Stuart Historic Group, which they have since 2017. And I also, Alicia, want to tell you, you're absolutely correct. Mr. Keck was the first architect hired by the school board.
Thank Gloria. And Don.
In the 20s to design their schools.
What a story.
Yes.
Yeah, what a story. Thank you.
Thank you.
I must add too, Nancy and I have initiated the historic signage with the two-sided kind. One would be Trimble, one would be Armstrong, and try to tell that history briefly. Even once we get it edited, still, I think, on Nancy's desk, but even at the state level, once we get it there, it's about 1.5 years, just for review and application and so on. But it's in the works. So,
and if I could add to that, historical markers are wonderful because we have them in many of our historic buildings already, the Golden Gate Building, the Arch. Because when you walk up to, it's on a post, it's a bronze plaque, it tells the text, the story of the building. Otherwise, we walk up to historic buildings and you really don't know anything. Sometimes you're lucky to find the year the building was built. But with the historic marker, you have the full story right there in front of you. And of course, anybody can read it, even children. It's so important that we get the children interested in history.
Roz? Yes. Well, I was just going to make a point that Stuart does a really good job of making Stuart walkable, and they have all of those signs around with historic areas, and I guess they would do it here too. But that's one of the things, I mean, I live in Port St. Lucie, I'm always in Stuart, and I'm always walking around, so this will be, you know, great to walk to.
That's a really good point, because right now, I think the kind of historic walking experience is mainly in the downtown. Not many people get down this way. That's something that I've always seen as something was hoping would happen in the future, that we kind of expand that sense of the downtown as including, you know, this stretch of East Ocean and all of those buildings you just listed kind of in between here and the downtown. That's a really good idea.
I just wanted to suggest something. As a musician, probably from the second I was born, because my whole family were singers and musicians, I always think about the aspect of everyone in this room. I guess our median age is more, but never mind. And we, because we grew up during the time that we grew up after World Wars and the issues our parents brought back, seeing architecture and seeing the life in Europe, and most of my family are, you know, from Germany and Switzerland, and that I learned a lot about that at the time. And I came from a very small community on the South Shore of Long Island, where there are still families there that are 6, 7, 8 generations. And it is like this knowledge of our heritage, and we try to keep it important. And I think that's one of the things about Stuart that I was so attracted, because that was my youth. I think how we fail is kids want everything to be new, cool, the newest thing, the best thing, the quickest thing, and we're not doing a great job in education to get these kids fascinated with some of this old cool stuff, because it really is fabulous. So I'm thinking, Nancy had said earlier that as we are working on the building, and the board has discussed this, that there will be tours of some of these young students from the middle school and the high school. And I am hoping, and I just got some goosebumps, that some of them will say, wow, be inspired. So we have to do a job and work with the school district and try to make them understand how important this will be to their future. They may not see that now, but I think it's, and I think the whole country needs to do this more in their education. I'm not just talking about Stuart, but I'm talking about this particular project.
I think it's so wonderful that Boys and Girls Clubs is right here.
Yeah.
And it's one thing I talked to Nancy about. I also volunteer at Hibiscus.
No.
And MartinArts has always supported Hibiscus. Yeah. And if anyone knows Ellie Lafer,
we do.
Just think if you can, I mean, not just studios, but workshop. An artist has kids come in and let them experience, let them dig in the dirt, let them see art, let them have a little drafting class. Mm-hmm. You never know what's going to light the spark. And I think it's just wonderful.
Because you can't have future orchestral players. I'm a musician. And you got to start in elementary school, because you're not going to have any orchestras in 20 years, because you won't have anyone trained. Yeah, get away from this and start doing this or playing the piano.
He's from North Shore, Long Island, so touch base with him and figure it out.
Any other questions for our panel?
I was just going to make a point, Don. Remember when we were outside, when we walked out the first time we were here today? You were talking about, we were looking at the trees and how they're kind of hiding the front of the building. You were talking about the importance of the light hitting those Art Deco architectural details, and how it's kind of a problem with vegetation at the old courthouse as well. Mm-hmm. Could you talk a little bit about that and just get people thinking about that?
Well, yes, and the important thing to remember about buildings built in the 1920s is the importance of the ornamentation on the outside of the buildings, because it's there for aesthetic purposes. In cases like on the old courthouse, it actually expresses ideals that are still important today. And this ornamentation was carefully designed by architects such that intense sunlight would hit it, because it's all three-dimensional. This isn't, they could have just painted all this stuff on the outside of the buildings, but the ornamentation is either incised into the building or projects out from the surface such that it creates shade and shadow in such a way that's very carefully designed by the architects to make the figures and the words in the ornamentation really stand out. In other words, so people could read the ornamentation, and it becomes part of how they experience a building. It adds to the, you might say, the spiritual aspect of a building, of these older buildings in particular. And so I think it's very important, and I think this, the Trimble building would be an excellent example of how to do this right, is in restoring our older buildings, be mindful particularly of public buildings. Their front facade is kind of designed as a billboard. It has things that the architect in the community was trying to say. It's very important that you have full sunlight striking those billboards so people can read what the sign's supposed to say. And I think that needs to be balanced against the wonderful things of having big shade trees, which we all love too on a hot summer day. So I think but it's very important, and I think in this case you could do a little of both. You could remove the trees in front of the building that are blocking which way is south? South that way or that way?
No, that way.
Oh, south. So the sun's, it's facing the sun. So right now, particularly there's 2 or 3 trees right in front of the facade of the building that are blocking that sunlight. And also the view of the building, as I believe Sandy was saying, this was, if you grew up in Stuart, this building was sort of one of the landmarks in town. There were no trees at all in front of it, and it really stood out, and it was a source of pride. But it took sunlight to make that happen. And so I think we have to balance our desires to sort of green everything up with an appreciation for sunlight and its role in bringing out architecture as it's intended to be experienced. Glad you reminded me.
Thank you. Well, the lady back here, ma'am?
I'm just wondering, at the end of the day, where are we? With what we're talking about? On the project?
Yeah.
Is Nancy here?
Nancy's here.
So the project is in conceptual design phase with architects, gathering information from other organizations like Lighthouse Arts Center, the Armory Arts Center, places near and far, to make sure that the ideas that we have for what we're putting inside will work. Talking to the local artist community, again, literary, visual, performing, about what they need and want. Talking with the educational community about what they need and want here. We have a couple of requests into the state of Florida, one in the Division of Historic Resources, one at Division of Arts and Culture, that would potentially, if they like what we said, get funded next year. Our local legislative delegation, Senator Harrell, Representative Snyder, Representative Oberdorf, all supported a funding bill this past session that really would have kick-started us much faster. However, the governor did veto that, so that effort it failed, but it didn't fail. We had great support, it just didn't make it to the final. So, we are in the process of beginning to talk with some people who love this project about their financial commitment to the project so that we can get things rolling. We are very much, as Karen was saying, looking at doing a phased project, starting with the 2 Armstrong buildings and the greenscape out front. Tom Lucido is working on the site plan. We are in negotiations with the lease for the school district. We have an intent to lease document with the school district. And that lease is being drafted as a 50-year lease with 2 20-year automatic renewals, so basically the next 90 years. So our philosophy has really been to move forward slowly, steadily, and with great thought, so that we're not rushing forward and doing something that then has to be redone later. So.
Would it be something that you would be using with the?
Yes.
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 Yes, I have a question. Is it done?
Don, yeah.
Don, do you know if there are any grants or monies awarded from the architectural field that, you know, might be interested in what you're trying to save here?
Yes, there are, and which is why I strongly recommend the National Register listing, because that really opens the doors. I was the architect for one of the first renovations of the Lyric Theater, and the first thing we did was get the building registered on the National Register as part of a more long-term plan to then be available for funding. So there's the various levels of government have funding for historic preservation, starting at the federal government. I hope the state of Florida does. That would be very typical. And then, you know, there are always, you know, the private sector, and there probably are groups out there that do specialize in that. So I do a Google search and kind of see what's out there today. I haven't been in that game for so long now, I don't know names off the top of my head, but there's always money to be found for those that are willing to, you know, keep going till they get it. Bring it in. It's almost a job in itself, but it's well worth it. You know, sometimes you can you know, create a job for yourself in the meantime.
And to sort of piggyback on what Don was saying, the school board will still own the ground and the buildings. So we are putting as a key tenant in our lease agreement that we would like to see is their permission to allow us to go for the National Register. We are not, will not be the owners of the building. So it is something they need to give us permission for.
Is that an option? Would you have an option about any building?
No.
No.
You don't want it?
No.
They don't.
Well, it's not an option from their perspective, so
Oh.
that's not, it's not on the table.
That's the land,
It's
maybe
not on
the
the table.
building's different.
It's hard to get insurance when you own just the building and not the land.
And then, you know, most of, I mean, their government funding, corporate funding will be a piece of this, but as anybody who's done any fundraising, the bulk of dollars for a capital campaign and really any operational funding for any nonprofit organization, the bulk of that funding comes from individuals in the community who support that. You need all three pieces of that pie to make it work, and we will chase all of those, because it is kind of like the good housekeeping seal of approval, you know, to say there's state grant money, federal grant money coming into a project gives the individual donors that confidence, that comfort level that it's a good, solid investment. So it's balancing act on all three of those fronts.
Is there any way that the county would help with operational costs? Sort of like what the city does with the Stuart Heritage Museum, you know, with the...
You know, there will be conversations with both the city of Stuart and Martin County about their role and involvement. I happen to watch some of the local county budget hearings lately, and that's not a conversation I want to approach anytime soon. George, I'm saving you a little bit. But, you know, this is a community-wide impactful project. It will impact tourism. You know, talking with the Tourist Development Council, they have in the past had grant programs for arts and cultural capital projects, you know, so that is something that could also happen in the future. So again, we are turning over every stone out there and pursuing all those options.
Naming.
There will be naming and commemorative opportunities, both for the buildings and every space inside of it. Happy to share those with people as we move forward. Thank you, Sandy. And, Debbie?
I'd just like to add something that probably you've all thought about, but I'll share it anyway. So for years I was in sales and marketing. That was years ago. And back then, the number was that any one individual had a sphere of influence of 250 individuals. Now that was 10 or 12 years ago. I'm assuming that has expanded by 5 or 6 or 8 times. My point is, it's important that we here today who believe in this, that we start talking to everyone you see, everybody. When you're waiting in line at Publix, or you're getting your prescription, or whatever you're doing, you just strike up a conversation. How long have you been here? Gee, have you heard what we're doing? And the enthusiasm, word of mouth is always, always the most effective way to do almost anything. But sometimes we shy away from it, and we think, oh well, they don't know, or they won't be interested. We don't know till you ask. And most people want to talk, and they want to learn. So I just offer that we all share and get the word out.
And thank all of you for being here. Thank you, Nicki, for this panel, and Don and Sandy and Alicia for participating. We have a little break before our 2:30 panel, which is another group of alumni, people who walked these halls and learned in these rooms. And in the meantime, there's still beverages out front and still all kinds of snacks and cake. Please take your fill, because otherwise I'm not quite sure what we're going to do with it. But eat up, enjoy, make sure you visit Alicia's, the historic exhibit is not your and feel free, there's several of us, myself included, if you have specific questions about where we're trying to go and what we're going to be doing here, happy to help. Dave's on the Dave Schoonover's on the construction committee. Bill Hip just walked in. He's very expert on the performing arts side of things, and other board members and people that can help answer some questions too. So thanks again for being here.
Oh, yeah.